Hello, and welcome to Live with Marketers, coming to you from the Empire State Building in New York City. I'm your host, Jan Martin Schwartz, and I lead the market development team here at LinkedIn Marketing Solutions. So we're on Fifth Avenue in New York, and through the windows behind me, you can literally look over onto Madison Avenue. So it's very appropriate that on today's episode of Live with Marketers, we're going to focus on advertising agencies. Now, there's a lot of talk about the challenges that the agency model is facing. But there's never also been a bigger need for what agencies do best: create and deliver breakthrough ideas that drive long-term business growth for clients. The business of advertising is about persuasion. That's always been true and continues to be true. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get started, some housekeeping. We'll be sending out the full recording after the event. Our LinkedIn and Twitter hashtag is LiveWithMarketers. And be sure to check out our webinar console on your screen to submit questions and subscribe to our blog. And finally, please take the brief survey at the end to tell us what you thought of the content. Now, let's get to the show. I'm delighted to introduce my two guests. We have Wendy Clark here from DDB. She's the global CEO of a very big, very influential creative agency, I think 12,000 people around the globe. And we have Rob Norman, who is the former Chief Digital Officer of GroupM and now a very active advisor, investor, board member, industry, commentator, the Oracle of Litchfield County, as friends call him. And I have to, full disclosure, Wendy and I have not known each other, but Wendy and Rob know each other very well, and then Rob and I know each other very well. So there's going to be a lot of banter, there's going to be a lot of in-jokes that we're going to try and explain. So let's start with, how long have you two known each other?
Well, we think January 2005.
Okay.
And we think that because I moved to the United States on the 26th of December 2004. The agency I moved to was the newly minted Media Edge CIA, part of WPP, and its biggest client was Singular Wireless, and Wendy Clark was at Singular Wireless at the time, and therefore, by orders of magnitude, because I moved from the US to the US from the UK, the biggest client in terms of spend and in terms of intellectual acuity I'd ever come across.
I'm not your client anymore, so you don't have to
Was she scary, or was she nice, or a little bit of both?
She was actually remarkable even then, because clients get the agencies they deserve by and large, and my sense is that Wendy was always absolutely full of enthusiasm, an unbridled champion of the brand she worked with. And she also worked for an extremely high IQ and high energy guy called Mark Nafar, who is a friend of both of ours. And Mark still to this day asks me the best question I've ever been asked by a client as a media agency, which was this. And he asked me, what are the 5 media truths for Singular Wireless? So in other words, what impact does reach have, what impact does frequency have, how important is competitive activity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I've always asked myself that question about all of my clients ever since. So I'm grateful to that, for that.
Amazing. So Wendy, we just had a bit of an origin story, but I really like the topic of origin stories because they're very powerful for brands, right? If you think about Apple, it's like Steve and Woz in the garage. Your own agency, DDB, the B stands for Bill Bernbach, who's one of the founders of Mother Advertising and a legendary, still very influential figure, even though he's no longer with us. But I want to hear about your origin story in this business, because I think that's a fascinating one. How did you get started in the advertising business?
Not spectacularly, as a receptionist in an ad agency. So went to school for creative writing, thought I wanted to write advertising. As you did in the early 90s, papered my resume everywhere. No one understands that you would even mail a resume anymore, but that's what we did. And the only opportunity I could find was as a receptionist in that agency. So I took the job, just believing that I would get my moment and I'd get my chance. And I quite like that story now, 28 years later, to be able to look everyone in the eye around DDB and say, look, I've done all the jobs from the receptionist now to the CEO, and I think a lot of that, there's a variety of reasons why that happened, but I'm quite thankful for those, early beginnings, because they taught me a lot.
Yeah, did you learn anything specific from being a receptionist that still resonates?
Without question. I mean, the number one thing you learn is never be above doing anything, right? If I had been too precious with my college degree to go into a receptionist position, I might not be where I am today. I mean, that sounds a bit extreme, but I do think, going in, believing in myself, believing that I'd get a crack at something, working hard for that crack, and just not being too precious to do that is a great.
It's about the
great
job
life
to
lesson.
be done rather than the title you have, right?
Well, yeah, and by the way, to this day, I would say I'm never above doing anything, right? So if we're in a pitch and everyone needs some coffees, I'm quite happy to run downstairs and grab the coffee for everyone so everyone can keep working and keep practicing and rehearsing. It doesn't, it's about the success of the outcome you're trying to achieve, not the particular role you play in that outcome, but that you actually get the outcome you want.
Acronyms, of course, play a huge part in the history of advertising. So DDB being among the most famous. There's another famous one, which is FCB. Which was Foot Cone and Belding, as I'm sure you know. And I was reminded of this because of a receptionist story that I was going to a meeting there for some reason, I can't remember why. And the phone rang on reception, and the young lady who answered the phone with the words Foot Cone and Belding. And it was fantastic because she made a complete onomatopoeia of her agency's name.
Yeah.
But you're right, when you first start, the world is divided into people that look for every place that they can stretch their task to create value and people that don't. And generally speaking, the people that do are either the most enthusiastic or the most curious. And if they can be both of the most enthusiastic and the most curious, you can be absolutely certain that they're going to be successful. Because so much of going into the world of advertising is almost like a kind of minimization of your role. However well qualified you are, people sort of are too busy and too preoccupied with their thing to care about your thing. And so what you do, if you're super enthusiastic, is that you take the thing they've given you to do, you find a way of, as people would say now, hacking that task in order to do it in half the time that they think it's going to take. And by making yourself available and making yourself ready and doing it with an openness of face and spirit, the opportunity comes to you. And it's amazing how, if you do that, it follows you through your career. And then you have these kind of blessed moments. And I think one of the things that Wendy and I have got in common is, I think in your case, and in mine, just at the point that I was getting a bit frustrated or about to be thinking about what the next thing would do, that somehow it opened up on its own. And I went for one job interview in 1985 in December. It's the only job interview, well, no, my first job in advertising I was interviewed for, but the only other one was in December 1985. The first one was funny because I was in reception at an agency and I said, I'm here to see Rod White, and who shall remain nameless. And this guy appeared down the stairs and said, are you Rod Norman? I said, I am. He said, I'm Rod White. I said, it's nice to meet you. And he said, what's 7% of 7? And I said, 0.49. And we went upstairs, had the meeting, and I got the job. And that was sort of the penultimate interview of my career.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to expand on that, like in terms of sort of what is the job now, what does the job then? Like, advertising has become very complicated, and I get the sense that oftentimes people who work at sort of entry-level roles in marketing don't really understand sort of the fundamentals of marketing anymore, because the roles are so specialized and you're really good at doing like the one thing that you do in the value chain, but like taking a step back and kind of understanding the fundamentals of marketing, like how you build a brand and how you create demand, like the really big questions, which I want to touch on today, like that's almost lost, because it's not like in finance where like unless you can read a balance sheet or do a discounted cash flow analysis, like they won't let you near anything. In marketing, it's different, and most of us don't study marketing and then go into marketing. So do you see that in your business?
I think we see it to some degree. I mean, I resist the temptation to use complexity as an excuse. Yes, I think for me the complexity is incredibly exciting, right? So it just gives us more canvases to paint on, more ways to solve the business problem. I think I just finished reading Checklist Manifesto. I'm not sure if you've read that yet by Atul Gawande, but the interesting thing about the complexity is the answers now cannot singularly lie with one person, and what he proves, again, medical, engineering, emergency response, restaurants even, because of this expansive nature of marketing and advertising, because of the expansive nature of medicine, engineering, et cetera, we can't now singularly solve these things. It necessitates that we come together, which I quite like, right? So you have to work in teams, you have to have those capabilities at the table, but when you have that replete set of capabilities together, there's no mountain you can't climb. I mean, it is just incredible, and it's truly exciting to kind of see those things lift off now. Yes, they take a lot of people. There's one of the phrases we're using at the agency a lot is, it's not complex, it's just hard. It is hard to do, right? And that's Usain Bolt, famous quote where he says, I've got to run from here to here. It's not difficult. It's just really hard to do. And so to do it at a repeatable high level is what my job, to sit and think about, how do we get those resources together, get all those capabilities, not let the complexity be an excuse for not doing it, but put up your sleeves, really think about the business challenge, how we can position a brand to garner success in that, and then execute execute well, and then repeat, right? That's the hard thing.
And to go back to the earlier point about remembering what the macro is, I mean, what marketing is about fundamentally is a whole range of activities that are designed to produce growth for brands and businesses. And it's a wonderful thing to be working in a business that's dedicated to the idea of growth. And it comes in many places, and there are many sub-disciplines within marketing, of which advertising is just one. But very often advertising is the one that produces the sort of the lighthouse moment of inspiration and the thing that kind of can change the vectors of the game overnight. But marketing overall is very much a team game, and it involves not just the chief marketing officer and the brand officers who sit beneath them, but in great companies, marketing involves CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, and others who are all looking at what the vectors of demand generation are going to be. Because the secret of success in all business is to operate at a higher rate of achievement than the guy that's next to you. You have to have a better reputation, you have to have a better product, you have to have communication that is on point, that leverages that reputation and that product. And the amount of energy that goes into that and the coordination of that, to Wendy's point, is absolutely hard. And I always remember this through the concept of, here's a good tangent for you, for the Dutch soccer team of the early 1970s.
I was going to say, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No. Well, I know Rinus Michels was on the tip of your tongue at that moment, who was the coach of that team. And he invented a concept called total football, which was in Dutch, total football. And the idea of total football was transform the game, and they first came to fame in the early 1970s. They lost the World Cup final to Germany, but they were the most exciting team of the decade. And it was summed up by one of their players, I think it was Ari Hahn who said it. So the difference between total football and footballers who've known it before is that everyone plays all the time. Even if you haven't got the ball, you're playing all the time. And my sense is that the object of the exercise in business, and then take it down, nest it down with all the functions, is to have everyone playing all of the time. There is no room, if you're going to win in whatever business you are, for people to stop playing just because the ball's not at their feet at that moment. And I think that this is the new game in marketing, and I think what's happened is that we've had to become so much more coordinated between the marketing function and the sales function, between marketing and sales and finance, between trade marketing and consumer marketing, so forth, and had to have such a kind of confluence and orchestration of activities that we've actually had to make quite a lot of change to the muscle memory in order for it to work. And if I was thinking about how the business has changed pretty fundamentally since I started in it to now, that would be it. That the range of the muscle memory and the range of the interpersonal and interfunctional relationships in business have become super complex, but very rewarding.
But there are a lot of silos, right? There's no question about that. And so for you now running in a very large agency where you deal with clients who are also very large and there's a lot of kind of different stakeholders on all sides, like how do you make, because big breakthrough ideas, right? Building a brand, that's something that takes a long time, right? It doesn't happen overnight. So you need your clients to sort of stick with you for a long enough time, and you need your clients to also align amongst themselves, right? There's a brand team, there's a demand team, there's the PR people, right? So how do you make that work? Like, is there a process you use? Does it depend on each client? How do you make that work?
Yeah, it varies dramatically by client, by category, by product or service. But I do think your point on the long-term brand equity building and the short-term sales building is a really important one, and it's one that we lean on some research that actually was done within our agency along with Les Bennett and Peter Fields.
I just saw Les last week in London.
Yeah,
great
so
man.
the long and the short of it that they did with the IPA in London really gets that to that sort of yin-yang relationship between the short-term and the long-term play, and you do have to, so what we really do use that as evidence with our clients to say, look, it's not one or the other. And when I was at Coke, it was, we would talk all the time about the long-term brand equity building and the short-term sales cycle and how we would blend them. Language I used to use was tent poles and tent pegs, right? And the tent only goes up with both.
Yeah.
The poles need to be, of a certain quantity and amount so that you've got height to the tent. And then the pegs are going to be in a higher quantity because they're going to hold it down. But, with no pegs, then it flags. And with no poles, it doesn't get off the ground. And so that sort of genius combination of poles and pegs or long and short, however you want to talk about it, that is very much the narrative that we have with the clients that we work with so that we do build for growth. So we do achieve those incremental sources of growth that every brand, every company is looking for. Even nonprofit, by the way. Everyone comes to us for some form of growth. Nonprofit want more donations, they want more subscribers, they want more followers, they want more headlines, more impact for their nonprofit, just the same way for-profit companies want incremental revenue and profit for themselves. So I'm never confused that we're in the growth business. We believe creativity is the most powerful force in business to achieve that growth, so that's our mechanism of how. But why people come to us is growth.
Yeah, I wanna double down on that a little bit and really talk about the difference between your colleague Les Binet and talk to us about that last week. The notion of there's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And a lot of marketers tend to confuse the two, and a lot of marketers tend to be obsessed with efficiencies. But before you can make something more efficient, you first need to make it effective. Right? That's kind of a key concept that not enough people seem to understand.
It sounds, when you say it, I just nod at you because I go, well, yeah, doesn't that sound obvious to everyone? And unfortunately, it's not the case. I do think where a little bit of the challenge comes in, a lot of people think that they have that sequential. So a lot of people think they're leading with effectiveness, with the efficiency after, but the first thing they talk to us about is efficiency. And so they lead with the other. So I think it's just one of those things as a marketer to always check yourself. Just check yourself. Is the language you're using, the briefs you're writing, is the vision you're stating, is everything sequentially making sense to the order of getting the effectiveness and the impact of your campaign right and then optimizing it for the highest efficiency? Does that land beyond something that you've said one time, but actually when you look at the actions of your organization, it might not? Because it does, again, we're in very difficult and tough business times. No one would dispute that. And so a lot of times, that narrative can get flipped around and you haven't even really realized it.
I think part of this is inside the agency business and in the macro around relationship between the agencies and their clients. It's about understanding the incentives of all the people involved, and there's a lot of organizations, both on the agency side of the equation and on the marketing side of the equation, who, because of the granularity of functions in the business, are often given incentives that are too narrow because they relate specifically to that function. And if your job is to generate leads through the e-commerce channel, say, your desire to create a set of incentives and measures that most support the idea that you have created the most leads through the e-commerce channel becomes your reason for being. Now, it may be that if you looked at it in the round, that if you increase brand preference by 2%, you actually got a greater increase in the number of leads through the e-commerce channel than if you spent it doing lead generation. There's other examples when actually the brand itself is insufficiently dynamic, as in not influenceable enough by some other metric, that spending it very narrowly in that channel is the best, if not the only way of achieving those goals. And so taking that rounded view and saying, what are our circumstances and what are our real goals? Now let's have a look at the people we're charging to do this with and the function with them. And then lining up the incentives in the right way tends to drive towards the right behavior. And that's pretty key, because behavior always trumps structure. There's no structure in the world that can survive bad behavior, but actually good behavior can overcome almost anything.
And that's back to your point on silos, right? I mean, and why I think the soft skill that we look for first, second, third, fourth, fifth is collaboration. If you cannot work together, you're never going to achieve the goals of an organization. Back to that sort of, there's so many touch points now, there's so much opportunity, so many capabilities we need to succeed, that you've got to be able to play well with others. And that sounds so fundamental to say that, but you know, I think if we're frank and honest, the history, certainly on the agency side, but in many cases in marketing and advertising in general, has been of, you know, the sort of obtuse, awkward, difficult person who was considered a genius but needed their own time in a dark room and space and left alone to do their genius. Those days are gone. We're so deeply intertwined now with one another. Not the least of which then is the client. I mean, the days of disappearing with a brief for 8 weeks and coming back with a reveal, we don't do that either. It's completely iterative. The client is completely working in real time with us on the solutions, because there's just no possibility, back to Atul Gawande, that one person has a corner on the smarts anymore. That's not possible. So collaboration, understanding a shared ambition and your role in it, paying people to deliver the ultimate ambition, not just their little silo and piece of it, that is absolutely the way business unlocks today.
Yeah, because you can have those sort of wonderful negative patient care outcomes if you think about it in silos. And you find very often that you go through a process and everyone thinks that they're doing exactly the right thing they should do. And you discover that the patient was in perfect health until the exact moment of its death. And that would tend not to be a good outcome by most people's standards. But actually there's so many things in life where the operation of the system actually exceeds the goal that the system was intended to achieve in the first place, and that can never be a good thing. The thing I would overlay on the idea of collaboration, which is important because the agency and the client and all the people at the client and all the people in the agency are in it together, and it pays to remember that, is that I find a collaboration of the curious as a very valuable construct. I think the idea that one of the jobs of management on both sides is to encourage the curiosity of the people working in those teams, for them to stretch their minds. And I'm always reminded particularly of Rory Sutherland at Ogilvy's marvellous line on this subject, which is, have you ever noticed how all creative ideas are subject to the review of business people, but almost no business ideas are subject to the review of creative people? And I think he's exactly right about that. And I think sometimes it's extremely valuable when you're in a creative process to actually get someone in who's in a really quantitative mindset, because they're a money guy or they're a forecasting guy or something like that. And equally, if you're a media guy or a programmatic trader or whatever, to call someone in and say, this is what I'm thinking of doing, but talk to someone who thinks about the world through a creative or visual lens rather than a numeric lens, and get their view on it as well. And I think one of the difficulties of the organizational structures that most of us have is that everyone's so focused and so hurry up that our ability to kind of open our minds and ourselves to other people and say, give me another point of view about this, just to kind of freshen it up, is difficult. And we sort of come in on ourselves. And I think one of the things that Wendy's done, and I'm just just listen to this, but actually don't listen to this part. So one of the things that Wendy's done, because Wendy was an agency person before she was at GSDM in Austin. Austin, yes, sorry. Right first time, again. She was at Austin before she went to Singular Wireless.
AT&T.
To AT&T before Singular Wireless, and then back to Coke, and then back to the agency world of DDB. But what she's always done is that she's encouraged people's curiosity and creativity, and she's always somehow found time to do that, and always somehow found the peripheral vision to know if there was a bit of the human machine that was struggling, that needed to kind of get going a bit more and stimulate it. And I don't think there's that many people that do it, but if anyone's watching this and wants to become a leader in business, it's the person wearing the dress that you should aspire to.
Thank you. That's very kind.
That's nice. Wendy, I have to, of course, jump in on that in terms of like you were agency, then you were client, then a different client, right? AT&T and then Coke, and now you're back to running an agency. So you're one of the few people in the world who can really like give advice to herself because you've been in both roles. Rob, unfortunately, spent his entire life on the agency side. So,
fortunately.
You know, this is really for you, Wendy. Like, what advice can you give to yourself? Like, what have you learned from being in both situations multiple times?
Well, it's funny you say that because I do say that I'm sort of bilingual, and that sounds a little bit weird to say that, but I can. I mean, when we're with our clients now, I feel like I can really help our agency decipher a lot of times the language that's coming over and some of the thoughts around things. I actually think I'm pretty good at helping our team anticipate those so that we don't even get to a place where that will be. And the truth is, it's all about empathy, right? Both jobs are really hard, right? It was really hard being a client, and it's really hard being an agency leader. It's not, so it's not that one's better than the other or that one's got an upper hand on the other or anything like that. It's just perspective and having the empathy across the table to understand that perspective. And it does take a little while. I mean, I had to undo my clientness in the first few client meetings where, we'd present and be like, okay, well, so we're going to do this, this, and this. And now I'm like, oh, wait, I'm sorry, that's your job. So I had to sort of not learn that I had to wait for the client to approve campaigns. I couldn't approve our own campaigns, but yeah, it's fun.
But what would you say, like, what do you wish one side would knew of the other and the other way around?
I think so I'd say from a client perspective, the agencies understand that advertising isn't the only thing that a CMO does. Like in the scheme of your day, there would be times where agencies would be bruised that I didn't have more time for them, or I hadn't engaged as quickly as I needed to, and you'd be like, well, guys, I was with the bottlers today doing this. I was working on a pricing thing over here. We had R&D, and I was looking at the 10-year pipeline on the products we're gonna like. That there's an expansive nature to what a marketer does. I think is sometimes lost at agencies.
Yeah, I mean that's I think a key point is like the notion of marketing is often understood as sort of marcoms, and that's it, right? But when you actually look at the sort of textbook definitions of marketing, it's pretty expansive. And there's Peter Drucker who said there's really only two functions in business: R&D, and then which is figuring out what the thing is you're going to take to market, and then marketing, which is about taking that to market, and everything else flows from that, right? But when you talk to marketers now, they're kind of defensive about that, and they feel in many ways that they're not being sort of respected enough by the rest of the organization, and not given enough budget, and not given enough credit for the contribution. But at the same time, I always say it starts with like having to take yourself more seriously if you want to be taken seriously, and sort of living up to the bigger definition of marketing.
That's on you. I mean, that's on you.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any company in the world with someone who has great ideas and has strategies and plans to improve business that will get shut down and not be heard. I mean, that's just... it was exactly what Rob just said on behavior versus structure. Behavior is the action that you're going to contribute to an organization. You have great behaviors and actions and outcomes. The structure is not going to hold that back. Yeah. So on the flip side, I would say the one thing that I think that it would be great if clients understood more about agencies is that we're not purely motivated by, the creativity of a thing. The most creative, the most successful creative people I've ever been around are really motivated by the impact of a thing. They're not interested in painting a Mona Lisa and no one being interested in their art. There's very little reward in that. The creative people who are brilliant really are about the impact that their art can have. And so I think a lot of times clients go, well, you just want to do the art of it. You're not really interested in the outcome of it. And well, not a lot of times, but you do hear that from time to time. And it is the fundamental connection between creativity and growth. No, we want to do this creative thing because we fundamentally believe that it's going to lead to the growth outcomes that you want.
And the word that goes in the middle of it is predictable, because it's easier to sell ideas, whatever kind of ideas they are, into an enterprise structure and to the boardroom and financial structures of business if you can rationalize and say, we believe that by taking this series of actions, we will achieve an approximation of this amount of growth over this period of time, and this is why. And I think there are many agency people and sometimes marketers inside organizations who have been perceived by their peers in the organization to pay insufficient attention to that and believe that some of the activities of marketing and the creation of communications are somehow an end in themselves. And we as an industry have always wanted, quote unquote, our seat at the top table, and the only reason why we should have a seat at the top table is if we are capable of demonstrating that what we do is a predictable contributor to positive growth for business. And I believe that the progress of marketing science over the years has been very considerable, but a lot of that progress has been deflected by some of the measurements of attribution that have been come to rise, particularly in the digital age, if I can call it that. I mean, there's people who are watching this that will say, you mean there was another age before there was a digital age? You don't really need that qualification anymore. But I do believe that the all-encompassing metric of what the effectiveness of marketing is has somehow been deflected to much shorter-term attribution things and has resulted in movement of budgets into too violent a swing in one direction rather than another.
Too much performance, too much demand.
Well, partly that, and I think maybe part of it's the language, the sort of brand versus demand language, performance, the idea of, because in order to have the idea of performance marketing, it almost suggests there's another kind of marketing that isn't about performance, and why would you do that?
It's actually, ironically, great branding, right? They call themselves performance marketers.
Well, so
they claim that.
So it is terrific branding from that point of view, because what it does is it depositions the rest of the practice. So in my mind, and this is not something that's kind of exactly washed its way into popular culture, but when I'm thinking about the world, I think about that we are in the business of demand, and within that we do two things: we create demand and we harvest demand. And sometimes they move closer together and sometimes they separate out, but I personally think that it's the harmony between creation and harvesting that makes the thing work. And I love the idea of taking a great creative idea to the trade marketing people who are then going to try and execute that brilliant idea within the walls of Walmart or within the digital walls of Amazon and pull it through. And then you really know you've got something, because when you get all of those people buying into that thing together, then it works so much more successfully. And the worst occasions are, again, when the incentives are not aligned and when people say, oh, well, it's okay if my bit over there works, so I'll make the measures fit the thing that I'm doing.
But you, Wendy, of all types of agencies, the big creative agencies, Bill Bernbach said, advertising is about persuasion, and therefore it is an art and not a science. That I think I'm paraphrasing as well.
I warn you against believing advertising as a science, was his exact quote.
Yes, yes. So how do you, first of all, do you believe that? And secondly, how do you then, in this environment that Rob just described, which is very short term, it's all about what numbers can you prove, right? Procurement. How do you create an environment where you can have these big breakthrough ideas that take time, that take bravery, that take a leap of faith, and like we established, you then have to stick with it, right? Like you can't just have a big breakthrough idea every 6 months because it's not going to do anything for you, because branding takes time.
Yep,
Right? It's
it
the
does.
long of it.
It is the long of it. So I do think Birnbach was speaking specifically around creativity. Obviously, a lot of the mechanisms that are available to us today on measurement and analytics and insight generation and all of LinkedIn, he couldn't have possibly even imagined. So I think it's about the use of that in aid of getting to great creative ideas that will drive business, right? It's not in replacement of. And I think that would be his warning as such. I do think, when you think about some of the fundamentals of what we've got to do and the short-term nature, a lot of times, listen, I sat in jobs where every 90 days you've got a built-in report card if you work for a publicly traded company, right? That's a very real feeling as a CMO. And it's very hard to say, well, but this campaign's got to take seed for 3 years, right? And you've got a 90-day report card. There's some challenge to that. The best thing we know to do is to propagate and share those ideas that have had exactly this impact. And we've got, there are a number of case studies out there, some of work we've done and others have done, that will show that the sustained commitment to campaigns and to brand equity, coupled with the short-term sales promotion activity, create the best possible outcome for a brand and for a company. And so most clients are very, very open and, in fact, desiring of seeing those and understanding them. People are looking for solutions, right? And so, everyone's coming with their idea or this idea or that idea, and I can, AI is going to solve all your problems. And, the next thing is just one page turn away. And I think part of it is just helping to create order and sense of that, and never lose sight of the fact that we're in the business to grow your brand. And we want to be, number one, as an agency, we want to be held accountable to that. So I think the accountability goes a long way to say that's a shared ambition that we have, and we want to be held accountable. And two, here's a set of examples of people's businesses that we've grown through practicing this way of working.
Yeah, and that often the way you stand out, the way you can be distinctive as a brand, is by having unique ideas that come from looking at the same thing that everyone else has looked at and having a new idea. And that is something I think is very hard for machines to generate, right? That's clearly the human element and the spark that you need.
And I mean, this will be the podcast of quoting Bill Birnbach. So get ready. We need your Bill Birnbach quote next. But another good Birnbach quote is where he says, if you stand for something, you'll find that people are for you and against you. If you stand for nothing, no one will be for you, no one will be against you. And I think that really speaks to doing mediocre advertising right now, doing mediocre marketing in a marketplace that is saturated. I think we can agree the average American has 6,000 brand impressions every day. You may as well not invest that money, right? I mean, you've got to figure out ways to break through, to make people care, to get permission to disrupt their feeds, that doesn't become something dilutive, right? And forgettable.
Yeah. So Alan Mulally, when he was the CEO of Ford, previously been the CEO of Boeing, I bet he's damn glad he doesn't have that job now. But when he was CEO of Ford, said one of the biggest faults of people working in the automotive industry, in the C-suite, is they'd sit in the top floor of their glass towers in Detroit, look down into the parking lot and see 100% market share. Yeah. And they would actually build for the people in their own parking lot. And so they kind of figured that there was this sort of almost vanilla kind of formula that made things happen. And too many people in business, and actually even in the agency sector, it'd be pretty okay in the agency sector if 30% of all of the clients in the world thought you were the most fantastic thing anyone could imagine, and the other 70% hated you. You could have a fabulous business built on that. And I think the ability to steer into large segments and large customer cohorts and large dollar opportunities in business, as opposed to attempt to find a middle line that takes you a little bit close to everything and never actually touch anything, is a temptation absolutely have to resist, and always steering for the middle of the
Well, and that goes
sides.
back to the career comment you made earlier.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you think about, you've got to be willing to put yourself and your career out there. You've got to be willing to say, you know, exactly what you're saying, to be curious, put yourself in a position that you might not perfectly know what you're doing, but have enough confidence to do that. Because otherwise, you know, playing the safe road from a career perspective is kind of forgettable too, right?
Well, it's funny. I'm countering your Bill Bember quotes with Rory Sutherland quotes. Another one of Rory's is that you have to be very clear that taking a position is not the same as a positioning, and
Right.
that taking a position is a much bolder place to be and leads you to much richer kinds of thinking than the idea of searching for a position. Because there's something about the word positioning that has a hint of
Has a back door to it, doesn't
yeah.
it?
Well, it does. It has a kind of hint of neutrality about it, and it says, well, okay, I'm going to position myself in such a way that I don't upset this person, I don't upset that way. But taking a position is a kind of declarative stance. And the one thing you can be sure about short attention spans, about clutter, all of the other things that allegedly sort of characterize our society and our interactions with media and brands, that unless you've taken a position, it's very, very, very difficult to get any form of standout. And, you know, Red Bull is an obvious example of that. Dove's campaign for real beauty was a very obvious example.
I mean,
Patagonia.
the brands just roll off your tongue. You know their position.
And you know who they are.
You know their position.
And the wonderful thing about those brands is that one of the things that agency people love working on most is if you can achieve a situation where after you have stewarded a brand for a period of time, you need to spend less on advertising with each passing year rather than more on advertising with each passing year, you've truly achieved something. And that's remarkable. But it does lead you to another place, or the same place again, that says, how do you create the incentives for someone to say, I will reward you more as a result of the quality of your work, I have to spend less money doing something than I did previously. And the mechanisms in the market are very, very difficult to get to that place. And that's a much broader issue than just about creativity. When I think about the business generally and the way it's compensated, I mean, more and more, well, still rather, we're paid very often, or the agency sector is paid very much on the cost of the inputs rather than on the value of the outputs, which would be fine, except if you're not rewarded for making the delivery of those impacts more efficient. And so someone says, I've got a way of thinking about this that's going to take 20% less cost than before. And if the client says, oh good, I'll have 20% of the money back, then that's not great. If they said, I'll share the rewards with you, then that's really terrific, because it aligns everyone to get to the same place.
Just to jump in, because this relates to an audience question that I got. The whole model of like being paid for performance, it's been going around a long time in this business, right? It's still a contentious point. Like, what's your latest take on, like, is this a scalable model? What's the right balance? Because, I mean, as to Rob's point, like, there's an upside and a downside, so does it work both ways, right?
I mean, listen, and again, back to, I mean, I do laugh because half the time I am negotiating with myself. We instituted pay-for-performance compensation at Coke when I was there. We were one of the first marketers to do it. If 2 years after doing it, when we plotted all of the projects that we had done pay for performance, which was everything, it was a perfect bell curve. Surprise, surprise. The number of people that were paid less than market value margin that we wrote down to single digit margin offset the number that got significantly more, and by and large it all fell into an average of about 17.65%, shockingly. So, I think, that, in my mind, from a client perspective, made a lot of sense. On the agency side, we've done, and somewhat publicly, done some deals with performance at risk, or if you want to say that. It's interesting because I think you have to work on your lexicon when we start talking about this, because if you've got profit at risk, then it's not a bonus, right? It's profit at risk. And I think it's always an important thing with our clients to reinforce. We're putting our profit, this isn't, because the clients will be accruing for it a different way in accounting and everything. It sort of gets quickly classed as a bonus. You're like, no, because I'm operating this thing at less than I need to, anticipating that I'm going to earn back some of this profit because of our performance. But let's not confuse that with a bonus. A bonus is typically incremental to a fair market profit. And so we've had to work on language a little bit because you can get kind of tongue-tied in that, and people start thinking, well, we did or didn't get our bonus. No. That's at-risk profit. Yeah. That's how we're running the fundamentals.
Which brings us to our dear friends, the CFOs and their various people in their offices who come and want to know how much something costs and want to try and be as efficient as possible. So I in my conversations with clients and partners, what often comes up is this notion of a lot of the stuff we talked about that makes a lot of sense to them in theory, and they even buy into it, but either they feel scared of doing it because it is hard, or they feel that they don't really know how to have that conversation with their finance people, and like asking for money that's invested in the long term, trying to not just ask for reallocation of budget, but incremental budget. So how do we change that dynamic where finance people like to have, by definition, a sort of antagonistic relationship because that's leverage, right? But at the same time, if we have the brand people and we have the demand people each sort of trying to be in the favor of the finance person, they're sort of playing each other off against the finance person, and they end up hurting the marketing function overall, because it's I'm either going to give it to you or I'm going to give it to you, versus what is the right level of investment in our future, the way you, for example, decide to invest in R&D, right? No one says, when is the return on investment happening on my R&D budget? It needs to be within the next 2 months, otherwise I'm not giving you money, right? They know it has to be 5 or 10 years. So how do you flip that conversation?
Well, the best idea, I already heard that on this podcast, is making sure we define performance marketing correctly, just as Rob just said, because I think so often our own language trips us, and so that, by the nature of saying, well, this piece is called performance, but everything else isn't performance, is a lethal way that we're doing business. So that would be one thing. When I was at Coke, one of the things we did just to get super comfortable with this is that we talked about just your basic 70-20-10 principle. So we'd say 70% of the budget is going to be on the bread and butter, the work we know gets the job done, blah, blah. And that, by the way, could have been up and down the funnel of communications, but the stuff we knew, the stuff we had evidence for, years of working with, so that's 70%. The 20% then was innovation off that known. So you've got the stuff that's now, and we're going to say, okay, we want to do a slight quarter turn on something. We're going to try some experimental things, but it's off a basis of a known thing. So we're just trying it a slightly different way. And then the 10% was your sort of VC, high risk, high reward. We're going to put some bets out there, right? And the number one thing I would hear is, like, from, again, going around markets in a global role, markets would say, well, I can't shift. I'm at 100 right now, and you're asking me to go to 70-20-10. And it would be, well, I can't make that kind of shift. Okay, well then, how about this? Start with 96-4. Let's start there, and then work your way. So I think the point is the principle of thinking about your budget in now, next, and sort of a new sort of, methodology, and applying it and getting the basis of that conversation going with the finance team. I like that,
because it's basically a portfolio approach, right? You're basically using the language of the finance person, saying, when you invest, you're not just going to buy all stocks, you're not going to buy all American tech stocks, and that's your entire portfolio, because that's not how it works, right? That's bad investing.
But it starts a language and a conversation then with the CFO that allows you to build on that, and then you come back and report on that. So last year, this was our 70-20-10. Here are our results. So this year we want to do this, right? And you just start that conversation.
I think this is actually an interesting jump-off point to get back into sort of the people side of things, because one kind of logical follow-up from what we just talked about is, like, we need better education, right? We need to train our people, we need to train our clients, our partners, we need to train everyone on, like, using that language in a way that is not so self-referential and kind of navel-gazing, the way marketers often talk, where it's all about Cannes and the awards, and CFOs don't care about that, right? So what do we need to do from, like, a talent development perspective? Because one, having worked in the agency world and having had a wonderful time there, the one thing that's always been difficult for me to understand is, like, why there isn't more investment in sort of a long-term training of people, because that doesn't really happen, or historically hasn't happened in the industry. And that's clearly something that needs to change if you want to attract young people to work in this industry.
There's an awful lot of people that arrived in the advertising business by accident. There's less on the creative side that arrived by accident because it was something they specifically wanted to do. On the business side of advertising, whether it's account management or on the side I worked in, which was the media side of the business, there's not that many people that at the age of 15 that think, I really want to be a media buyer, mostly because they have no idea what a media buyer might be. And in fact, in many cases, they don't even know there is such a business. They understand that in the world of advertising, people make ads, they get that. They understand that those ads fit in a Facebook newsfeed or in a television program. They have no idea that somebody is involved in optimizing the transaction of how those fit together. So we tend to, as a category, have a lot of accidental tourists arrive in our business. Now, what I think we're worst at, and we're terribly bad at any number of things, but the thing that we're worst at is finding a mechanism to determine what good talent looks like early. It's very difficult to do before they start because of the diverse backgrounds they come from. But when they arrive in the business, being able to observe a new intake, and it's rapid because we don't pay very well at the entry level, particularly on the media side of the business, and identifying that talent early is really important. And what I've always encouraged people to do is to look at who has both the focus to get the job done and the peripheral vision to understand what the context of the job they're doing is. And then you have to pick up that talent really, really quickly and separate them from the pack and develop them fast. And one of the first things you have to develop them for is to show where they fit in the chain of demand, what it is that you're doing that impacts things that are happening in business. And one of the bonuses of the, I'm going to say it again now, the digital age, is it's become so much easier to explain. When you can get people to say, okay, what's going to happen is you're going to do this, this is going to happen, someone's going to take an action on their phone, and that's going to trigger a direct piece of demand that flows through the system, and they can join the dots so much more easily, and then elevate them back to the bigger picture. But I do believe that we have to treat people like adults. I do believe that we have to teach them to be curious about not just what they do, but the context of what they do. And we do have to tell them and help them learn early as to what the business priorities of our customers are, as well as what the business priorities of our company is.
The only build I'd make is I think you're seeing a lot of shifts and changes at schools like VCU Brand Center and SCAD and others who have now new paths through the schools that are much more current and contemporary with how we're practicing, number one. Number two, technology, people, the kids, come out of school now with the full suite and ability on their laptop to create, produce, edit, write. It's all done. I mean, and they're doing that in high school. They're doing that in college. My kids are doing it on their, part of their submission is in that. So I do think to a certain degree the education system is keeping up to a certain degree. But mostly the on-the-job training of having to, present to really smart, savvy, sophisticated clients is about the best training you can have. And that's what I quite love so much about agencies is, one day you're automobiles, one day you're QSR, one day you're insurance, one day you're banking. I mean, you really get
and you get thrown in at the deep
total
end.
view of, and these are juniors working under more senior people, but that immersion in our business, being involved in new business pitches, and that the lessons and the learning, I think one of the things we do with, with our younger team members is make sure they pitch. And pitch is the best, it's a completely condensed experience of what you'll do over a long amount of time on an existing client, and you learn exactly the steps.
Selling an idea, it's
6 weeks instead of 6 months, and so I think our environments can be immersive and good training. And the final thing I'd say, when again at Coke, we actually struck deals with partners where we would do cross-training. So we actually did a job trade with Google where we had some people seconded to them and we took some of their people seconded to us so that we could create that empathy, that learning, that understanding. And I think partners like LinkedIn and others are very open to bringing their talent, their wares into our agencies, into our organizations to help that training. So I think there's a lot out there.
Yeah. As a follow-up, what's clearly very important is to sort of open up access to these roles to a broader set of the population that reflects the types of people that these brands want to reach, right?
Yep.
So clearly diversity, inclusion, and
Yep.
belonging is something that the industry finally has started talking about, which is wonderful. And I think the smarter companies have realized it's actually not just morally the right thing to do, it's actually good business because it brings you a broader perspective. And in marketing, you don't want to be the Ford guys looking down, from like the olden days, looking down on the parking lot saying everything is great because everyone drives a Ford, right? You want to have the true reflection of society in-house rather than having to kind of commission research to find out what people are thinking. But while that is like I think the intentions are right in a lot of places, but how do you actually walk the walk? Like, how do you actually make it happen, right? Instead of just having a lot of industry panels, which, don't get me wrong, that's a wonderful thing that's being talked about, but you have to actually do something about it. You have to implement it. Right?
You do.
Yeah.
And I think the only way to get to that is sort of public accountability, is saying, I will put this many people in position and being held accountable to action, right? Because there is a lot of narrative, a lot of optics, a lot of wrapping paper. Everyone's good at the
Packaging.
the language of it, but I think we've got to be willing to say, okay, well then tell me, Wendy, tell me about the diverse candidates that you've put in role. Who have you put in a leadership position? And I need to be able to evidence those to you and say, this is what we're doing to reflect the marketplace that we serve for our clients. That's exactly what we have to do. And by the way, I think that there's obviously the gender, culture, religion, age, ability, sexual orientation, but we also need to make sure we have socioeconomic perspective too. These are not necessarily classified as diverse points of view, but one fantastic lesson I had. We were working on our internship program. So one of the things, again, leadership speaks, and I said 50% of our interns will be diverse. That was an important message to say. If we don't, where do we start? We've got to start with the very young people coming into our. So that was a good edict from on high. Thought I'd done my job. End of internship program, inspected what I expected. Numbers were something like 54% or something. I said, right, job done, tick. Well, one of the really great people in my agency said, so Wendy, when you think about internships in New York and Chicago, which are the places we were talking about, how much do you think it costs for a kid to come and live in New York and Chicago? And you can see the unraveling of my grand plan here. He said, all you've reached is and this was an African-American man, he said, you've only reached the affluent black kids or the affluent Hispanic kids. You're not really reaching the marketplace. And so as we began to talk about it, it was like, okay, next time as we do this, we've got to figure out some sort of housing combination. Like, if we really are serious about getting the diverse perspectives in our business, we're going to have the total conversation and make sure that we've thought about how do we reach the people that we want in the business fully, that can really come and participate in New York City and have that internship and shape our agency.
Yeah. Yes.
No, I was just going to say, and I think we also need to look at different educational institutions. Some of the ones we've classically done. You're absolutely right. VCU and others do a tremendous job. But right here in New York, up in Harlem, there's CCNY, which is a famous school. If it's good enough for Colin Powell, it's good enough for me. And CCNY is a wonderful place. They have a master's course, their BIT course now, which is really good. And the great thing about CCNY is it costs $5,000 a year in fees. And you will find that if you go to meet undergraduates at CCNY. I think it's the most diverse school on the East Coast, at least by a distance. But a lot of the kids there are actually doing full-time education, but they're working in Tango Bell or Edible Arrangements or wherever it might happen to be. Real just to get enough money to keep going. And I think that the amount of difference we can make to those kids, either by kind of actual participation, by going to them, bringing them to our offices and so forth, is just huge. And I worry, to your point about saying, a diverse group who are united by the fact they're in an elite socioeconomic group is no diversity at all in the end. And I'm actually very proud of the talent function within my former employer at WPP and at GroupM, and our head of talent at GroupM, has been absolutely focused on creating the greatest opportunities for people with physical disabilities, as well as all of the other standard variations of diversity, and the effect that it's had on the atmosphere of the building is fascinating. And I'm not proud of what the diversity looks like in the top 5% of the payroll of the business now, but I'm increasingly confident of what it's going to flow up to.
So there is hope
over time.
That's
well, I think there's hope, but I think that hope has to be met with continued action and continued vigilance. I think this is no longer a place that you can just hope.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be willing as a leader to inspect the very granularity of the business to get to some of the root causes. And when I was at Coke, I led the Women's Leadership Council, and there were a number of things we uncovered, but that were institutional to the business. Coke is a fabulous place. 206 countries and markets around the world. I mean, they are the world in many cases. 1 billion Cokes are drunk every day by 1 billion people. So very diverse business and portfolio. But it is 130 years old. And we have to remember, and again, it's the Women's Leadership Council, Coke was created at a time when women weren't working.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of the foundational aspects of a company that's 130 years old, it was built for men. There's no apology to that. It's just a reality that we have to make sure we move. One of the things, when I joined Coke, I relocated from Texas, from AT&T, and they relocated to me. And in my relocation paperwork, it was standard paperwork, and it said blank, where my name was, Wendy Clark, and trailing spouse was the language used for the partner, trailing spouse.
Yeah.
Right? Well, that was because most executives that they'd ever move were men, right? And so that was just an institutional thing. And once my husband, who has an MBA, said, I'm sorry, am I a trailing spouse? Like, I don't want to be your trailing spouse. I have a career and I'm a person in my own right. I'd like to be, Wendy Clark and spouse. I'm fine being your spouse, but I don't want to be your trailing spouse, right?
So we've come a long way, but there's a lot to be done.
Back to language, right? Yeah. Back to unintended, but we have to really granularly look at things that have unintended consequences in communications.
Yeah.
And
so
awareness,
being aware and being able to listen is key. Yeah.
Well, and being willing to get into the details, down to things like that have an unintended communication and action and change, which Coke did. Yeah. Coke now has, over a third of their senior leaders are women and growing.
That's great. That's great. I think we're out of time, unfortunately, but this has been fascinating. So thank you so much. For those of you watching, thank you for watching. Please fill out the survey and tell us what you thought of the content. Wendy, thank you so much. Rob, always good to see you. Thank you so much. This is it. See you next time on Live with Marketers. Thank you so much.
Thank you.